it can be a state, and it could even be a country. You know, and it kind of depends in what context you're talking. And I think it's really important to start here because this is a word we use a lot in our field, obviously. And I think oftentimes the person using the word community and the person hearing the word community are not operating on the same definition. And that can cause a lot of confusion. And sometimes you want to have a little vagueness and confusion, but sometimes it's problematic. And so as we use that term throughout today's class, and I would encourage you when you're using it generally to at least be intentional in your own mind of what community you mean. Is it every single person who lives in the zip code 02119? Or is it the low income people that live in your buildings if you're a CDC that live in 02119? So that's a key thing. And then another sort of key kind of grounding piece for me is these core values that I think really define the field to a significant degree. And so one, again, right at the top, community voice, community power. We'll be talking about this throughout the morning. I'm sure you've heard this before, that what community development is about giving people who live in a place or live in a certain community some agency, some control, some authority over the future of their own lives and the future of the place where they live. This gets expressed in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's called civic engagement. Sometimes it's about community voice. Sometimes it's about community power. Depending on which words you use, it can sound a little different in terms of where you are on the political spectrum, maybe, or sort of where you want to be tactically, what language resonates for different people. But pretty much anywhere in the United States, if you're talking about community development, there's some element of self-determination, empowerment, community voice, community power that's part of the equation. But it can't just be about community voice and community power. Lots of communities that might result in things that are exclusive, that oppress people. We've seen that time and time again, where folks in a community use their power and voice not to include and welcome, but to exclude. So economic opportunity or economic justice, again, slightly different tone, but that's a key fundamental principle of community development, that we're about lifting people up economically. So if you're using your community power to hold people down, that's not community development. If you're using your community power to lift people up, that's community development. It's an important difference. And then racial justice, inclusion, racial equity. Again, the vocabulary has changed and evolved over time, and people use different vocabulary in different places, but fundamentally, racial equity and racial justice is a core value of this field. The community development field really emerged out of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, so that's really where we come from, and it's been a core principle throughout. This might look differently in an urban or a rural area, or depending on which different kinds of groups are living in a particular place. But again, community voice has to be in furtherance of racial justice and economic opportunity, not in opposition to that. And part of what community development gets interesting is when these values run in tension with each other. So we're all about community power, but we support legislation that forces suburban communities to have affordable housing, even if people in that community don't want it. And we think that's consistent with community development, but if these values are coming into tension. So anybody sort of want to challenge any of these three, or do you feel like I'm missing something critical? You can shout it out or put it in the chat. I encourage you to use the chat throughout as a way to kind of engage with me, and Leah and I will try to keep up with that. But there's lots of other values you can talk about, collaboration and all sorts of things, accountability, but to me, it really boils down to these three. All right, so then the question is, what are we trying to accomplish in community development? Well, this is going to be our first breakout session. And I want you guys to introduce yourself to each other. And what do you think this is all trying to achieve? What's the end game here? What are we trying to accomplish? And if that's too philosophical for you, then just speak personally, like why did you get into this field, or why are you interested in this field? What are you hoping to change about the world?
Someone in our group brought up a really good point of connecting resources. So not just, and the example that they used was not just providing free groceries, but then an additional nutrition program to go along with those groceries.
Yeah.
And so seeing community development kind of as like the yes and mechanism to kind of empower and bring everything together.
I like that. Well, here we go. Bring local control to real estate development. Yeah. Equitable housing. We'll talk more about what that ultimately means. Other thoughts? Developing social political capital to impact changes, helping communities make their own choices. Yeah, exactly. Well, I've been trying to figure out the answer to this question for a very long time, and I still don't know. So I answer questions with questions. So this is some of the things that I think, and some of this you guys touched on in your comments, but I think one real challenge for community development is, are we trying to reduce poverty? Are we trying to improve the quality of life for poor people, or both? And those can be different things. You know, if you give somebody with a low income a nice stable home that they can afford, you've improved their quality of life perhaps, but you haven't necessarily changed their income, and they might still be, you know, technically in poverty. You know, if a community works together to clean up a park and make the park accessible to children again after years of it not being accessible, you've improved, you know, they've collectively improved their quality of life, but they maybe not changed their economic standing. So I think that's one question. Then there's often this debate, are we focused on the people that are in the neighborhoods? If you physically improve a neighborhood and the buildings are nicer, they're better maintained, the infrastructure is more modernized, the parks are better, the schools are better, but if the folks who live there are still struggling to make ends meet, you know, is that good enough, or is that part of what we're trying to achieve? So you'll see a lot of conversation about people or place. Are we trying to change neighborhoods, or are we trying to keep them stable and the same? You know, early in the community development movement, when we were working largely in neighborhoods that had been really historically disinvested, lots of vacant property, fires, arson, things like that, you know, clearly the goal was to change those neighborhoods to make them a different kind of place. But now there's a lot of fear that neighborhood change is going to mean displacement and gentrification, and there's a hesitancy about neighborhood change, and we often talk about stabilization. So again, that's a question and a tension. Is community development really just focused on physical development, or does it include things like food and health and education and job training and childcare? How broad a definition should it be? Are we building community wealth or individual wealth? Rightfully, there's been a lot of attention in recent years on the racial wealth gap. And the racial wealth gap, you know, it's obviously the legacy of decades and centuries of discrimination and oppression. So is the response to that now that we should help people of color, African Americans, build their private wealth, the way many of us have been able to do it? Or are we trying to build community assets like community land trust and shared equity homeownership project? You know, when a nonprofit owns real estate, it's owned by the community. When individuals own real estate, it helps build family wealth. Those things can be at odds. There's a lot of tension sometimes in our field about that. Are we trying to create racially integrated neighborhoods, or are we trying to protect historically African-American or Latino neighborhoods from being gentrified? This is a really tough question, you know, in the fair housing context. You know, I certainly grew up in an era where, you know, we were talking a lot about integration was the solution. But I think there's a lot of folks now maybe not so sure about that maybe that's not the right focus, or maybe it's the right focus in the suburbs, but not necessarily in the cities, you know? So again, I think that's a tension. And, you know, how much gentrification is a good thing? How much neighborhood improvement having a more mixed income neighborhood is a good thing? And when does it become a bad thing? So, I frame this a lot in terms of questions. And for most of these questions, I would answer that it should be both. But sometimes it's hard to have both. But I think it's really important for people to understand that sometimes the debates and conversations and struggles we have in the field aren't just about the tactics, but are really fundamental questions about different views on what we're trying to achieve. So I see a couple of people have added a couple of thoughts here. Environmental racism. I think equity, one of the good things about the word equity is that it is inherently about balance. And arguably the answer to these questions is about balancing these outcomes. So equity is a good way to think about that, but it doesn't fully answer the question. Does any of this strike you as like completely nuts? Is there anyone want to, does this make sense? Has anyone here struggled with these tensions, say on individual wealth versus community wealth? Something like that. I invite people to shout out or in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with.
I know at least for me, that question of community wealth or individual wealth is something that I always come back to, because it feels like the American mindset and the American dream really prompts up individual wealth. And it's hard to say that that's not a good thing, right? Everyone should be able to build their own wealth, pass that on, should they choose to, invest it how they'd like to, and just generally for security and happiness. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, community wealth seems like it benefits everyone. So I think you're right about trying to find that balance. And I think that balance looks different in every community and with the people that you're talking about.
Yeah. Thank you, Abby. Okay.
Is there an inherent focus within the CDC community to think about collectives versus the collective action rather than individual action? It feels like if in terms of those tensions, it feels like there's a bias within the field.
I think that's probably accurate. Maybe a little, it's hard to generalize fully, but I will say certainly that was my bias and probably still is, that I like the idea of community-owned assets, nonprofits that are owned lots of real estate that's there for the community for decades and decades, and that the wealth and money generated gets recycled into the community. So, Madison Park has accumulated a lot of wealth as a CDC in Roxbury, and they poured that wealth into a $5 million community center a few years ago, as opposed to a private owner who could have poured that wealth into, a second home in Florida. So, to my mindset, that makes a lot of sense. But, easy for me to say, I own a single family home. I have a nice retirement account. I benefited from white privilege and inherited wealth, so like, I have to check that a little bit. And, I've had lots of debates over the years with folks who are like, why when it's time for communities of color to start rising up, does everything have to be shared? It wasn't like we did that, 50 years ago. So, but I would say, by definition, the fact that we're nonprofit institutions and nonprofit ownership is a form of community ownership. It's held in stewardship for the public interest, does indicate that bias. And certainly the community land trust movement, the worker co-op movement, the community co-ops, all of those things are about shared wealth, shared ownership. And ultimately, I guess I would argue you do help more people. As long as we're all just sort of in an individual wealth game, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And if we want to accept that, who the winners and losers are might change, but we're always going to have lots of folks at the low end, that strikes me as kind of a defeatist approach. But I think there are legitimate arguments about that. All right, let's press ahead. And we've kind of hit on some of these tensions, but just underscore a couple of others. We talked a little bit about people in place. Another dynamic that's really been in conversation over the decades is, should we be focusing on neighborhoods or focusing on regions? Where is the right leverage point to lift up people economically? Neighborhoods can be isolating. Most of us don't. I used to always say most of us don't work and live in the same neighborhood, but now many of us work and live in the same house. But you know, traditionally, lots of people have left their neighborhood for employment, left their neighborhood for shopping, for church, for whatever. So we do live in these larger regions, but on the other hand, the scale of impact that people can have at the neighborhood level is different. You can really affect change at the neighborhood level. Another tension in the community development field, and especially as it relates to CDCs as a particular type of organization, is do you try to approach things comprehensively, tackling a whole range of issues from housing to business development to job development to youth to seniors, or do you specialize in one field like housing development? And there's good reasons for both. It's hard to do both. It's hard to be highly proficient and skilled at complicated things like job training or real estate development. It's even harder to be really good at doing all of those things. So that's a tension you see. The demand-driven community development versus service delivery model is another thing you'll see. So we say we're all about community-driven process and resident-led and listening to the community. But obviously, at the end of the day, the funders and the government officials have a lot of say and control over what you do. And so you might ask the community, what kind of housing do you want built on this site? And they might say, we want mixed income, we want home ownership, we want family housing, we want senior housing. But at the end of the day, you can only build what the government is willing to subsidize, which is usually rental housing, not home ownership, usually larger buildings, not smaller buildings. And so I think one of the challenges for CDCs is how do you reconcile what you can do and what the community wants to do? And my view, too often the folks with the money end up dictating more so than the folks in the community. But that's another dynamic. And then some other things, you know, the money versus mission as nonprofits that are operating as a business, folks are struggle. Sometimes we have to make money. We have to look after the bottom line in order to achieve our mission. But if we focus too much on the dollars, do we lose sight of our mission? You see a lot of debate in the field about what the right size organization is. Are you big enough to have professional and the depth to do what needs to be done and do complicated projects? But at a certain point, if you become too big, do you become bureaucratic? Do you lose touch with the community? And then we talked about this private and community wealth. So part of what is fun and interesting and exciting about community development is navigating all these tensions, because there's no one answer. But it's important to name them, I think, and to sort of be aware of those tensions and that you're living and navigating those. So cut yourself a little bit of slack, that you're not the only one that's facing them, but also so you can be more intentional about the choices you make. So there's a comment, Carl, do you want to say a little bit more about the distinction between planning for people and planning for place? Because we touched on that, but I'm curious what you're thinking in that comment. This in the chat.
Hi, I guess I work in a small city with a very low income demographic. So the tensions of gentrification are real every day. Anything we do is potentially leading to long-term displacement of our current residents. So there's the tension, particularly when you're looking at a specific project, is, you know, do you think about that as a physical location and how you need to improve it? Or do you think of it in terms of the people who are living in or adjacent to that area? And how do you create something that is positive for them?
Yeah.
And, you know, because by and large, property is privately owned and development is driven by private capital for the most part. There's, immense pressure to allow people to do what they want, and yet at the same time to almost subtly influence what they're going to do, or overtly influence through community processes, what they're going to do. And, I'd like to say that by and large, we try to plan for the people we have and not plan for the people that some in the community want to have.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very, common challenge and well expressed. So thank you. To some degree, those dynamics are driven by scarcity. If every physical neighborhood in Massachusetts had great physical assets, then it'd be easier for people of varying incomes to have a neighborhood and to live in a neighborhood with great physical assets. So I think that to some degree, we accept in our capitalist society a certain level of scarcity and then fighting over the scarcity. So, a lot of the conversation around schools is who gets to go to the good schools and who has to go to the bad schools, as opposed to, how do we make sure every single school is great? If every single neighborhood had great amenities, then more low-income people could benefit from those amenities. So, but in the meantime, we have to deal with that reality. So, that comes up all the time.
Yeah, and it's also about, kind of mitigating externalities within the system.
Yeah.
So, there are all of these side effects of policies and just how society is structured that causes adverse impacts on portions of the population. So it's understanding what those are and finding strategies to help mitigate them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I just in the chat, I think Abby, you made a good point here that if certain aspects of your life are kind of taken care of, it allows you to invest your time and resources in other things. So, retirement security is a good example of that. The Social Security Act provides retirement security for virtually all Americans, at least some level of retirement security, more than we had before the Social Security Act. And so then that frees up people to think about their resources in other ways, and free education, K through 12 helps. If we have free college, that would help more. So, okay. So I think Leah sent this video out in advance. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to, because a lot of how the community development field exists today is shaped by our history, like so many other things. So, but we don't have time to really go into that. As a state association of CDCs, we have tried to come up with a framework for articulating what CDCs do that reflects urban, rural, and suburban communities and a whole range of variety within them. And we sort of landed on this framework, which is imperfect, but I think is helpful nonetheless. So we start at the top with building communities. And again, this sort of relates back to the conversation we were having about community voice and community power. It's about having sort of effective civic governance in a place. I've learned a lot of what I know about community development from the folks at Lawrence Community Works. And I remember their executive director saying that Lawrence was a place years ago where every faction had enough power to stop something from happening, but nobody had enough power to get anything done. And so the place was sort of dysfunctional. Maybe it's a little like, Washington sometimes, but Lawrence was dysfunctional in that there was a lot of fighting, a lot of anger, a lot of voice, but there weren't any mechanisms or relationships or institutions that were able to help people find some common agreement or enough agreement to move forward. In other places, the dysfunction can be that one group just has too much power. Usually it's the old timers, the homeowners, long-term residents, that kind of thing. And so to have effective civic governance, you need to make sure more voices are heard. And CDCs can play a really important role in creating and supporting and sustaining that sort of civic infrastructure. Then the arrow goes to improving place, because we are about places. We do believe that the physical environment matters. I think there's lots of evidence in health and education and public safety that the physical surroundings do matter to people's life outcomes. And so having modern, healthy, quality housing is important. Having infrastructure, having businesses that are local, so on and so forth, creating the right place. But we don't stop there. And I think a lot of folks think of community development and they sort of stop on the place bucket. But increasingly over the last 20 years, most CDCs, the vast majority of CDCs, have all sorts of initiatives and programs that are really aimed at people, whether it's homeownership education or financial coaching, or helping people start their own business, or offering resident services to the residents in their buildings, which could be, you know, around health or nutrition or youth activities and so forth. So, and the idea is as people's incomes and lives gain stability, they're also better able to participate in the civic life of the community because they're not, you know, as focused on their day-to-day, you know, economic survival. So there's a virtuous circle here. Just to say a little bit about who some of the players are in community development, because, you know, obviously at MACDC, we focus a lot on CDCs, and this presentation probably has a little bit of that orientation, but there are lots of stakeholders and lots of organizations that are involved. Community development financial institutions are well, they can be nonprofit or for-profit, but they have their focus on lending and financial investments. And a big part of the community development story is about getting capital and dollars invested in places that were previously redlined and disinvested. So that's a big part of our field. Obviously, local and state and federal government. We have some folks from that world here with us today. Banks and credit unions and financial institutions play a huge role because you can't build real estate without money. There's foundations and donors that shape the field with their priorities, and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit more about this throughout, but effective community developers and effective community development organizations learn how to play with all these different people. You have to understand their language, you have to understand their motivations, their constraints, because along the way, you're going to be partnering with all these different people. And I suppose a core belief of many of us is that if you can figure out how to work with all these different people and all their different interests, you've probably come up with some pretty good ideas that are going to be durable and sustainable over time. Just to say, you know, what is a CDC? Just to, you know, there is an actual definition in state law. This is what it is. You'll notice that it starts with local residents and businesses and puts them as the sort of subject of the sentence. So we're trying to give local people agency in this definition. We do not define community development very precisely here. So for better or for worse, we make it explicit that CDCs can operate in any kind of community, not just a low-income community, and that it's focused on sustainable economic development or economic opportunity. I've literally had people call me to say that they're forming a Little League, and can a Little League get CDC certification, or a community theater. And Little League and community theaters are great, but they're not CDCs. Community health centers are great, but they're focused on health. That's their primary mission. Primary mission of a CDC is economic opportunity. So it's maybe an arbitrary line that we're trying to draw, but if we're going to have this term mean something, we felt we needed to have some kind of circle around it. And the statute requires that the constituency you serve have meaningful representation on the board. We left it somewhat open as to specific numbers of what that means, but we're trying to root that core value that the people who are going to are in charge of the organization. So, this Massachusetts is one of the few states in the country that has a state definition. It was first enacted in 1975 by Mel King. the namesake of our institute. In 2010, we updated the definition, and this is what we came up with. So, and here's just a little bit more detail on how the state defines it. There are 64 state certified CDCs right now in Massachusetts. Just certified 3 new organizations in the last couple of weeks. All focus on serving immigrant communities, not geographic places. So you can be either way. So let's talk a little bit about community building, that whole piece of the pie. So community building, I think, means different things. There's an aspect of which is accountability, that if you're a community-based institution, you're just inherently more accountable to the people who live in the community, that if they have a complaint, they know where to find you. And that might even be a local grocery store when you go shopping. And that's one aspect of it, just that if you know you're going to be in a community for a long time, you're going to have to live with the results of your work. You're going to approach it differently than if you're sort of parachuting in from out of state and moving on to the next state right afterwards. But another aspect of it is collective ownership. We've talked about that, but when a nonprofit owns a physical asset or any kind of asset or accumulates wealth, that is legally shared by the broader community and needs to be used in public interest. Part of what we mean sometimes is social capital, building those connections, helping to facilitate relationships, creating social events and other opportunities for people to get to know their neighbors. Not necessarily in service to any particular political agenda, but just because it's nice to know people. And if you know people, then when you need help, sometimes they're there. I sort of think what Joe Biden said in his inaugural address, that sometimes people need a hand and sometimes people need to lend a hand. That's how I think of social capital. And I think CDCs are about creating that space. But it's definitely also about creating a way for residents to shape and lead the decision-making about what's happening in their community, what kinds of programs and services and real estate development is going to happen. It's about helping individuals in the community build their own personal leadership skills so that they're effective advocates for the things they care about. It's about changing power. Who has the power to make things happen in your area, in your municipality, in your town? And we're about trying to make sure that low-income people, historically disenfranchised people, people of color, immigrants, people who don't speak English as their first language, have more political power. That is I think some CDCs are more explicit about that than others, but to me, that's a core piece of it. And then they're sort of contributing to this sort of broader civic capacity to make sure that there's sort of effective ways for the community as a whole to ultimately resolve conflicts and make decisions. So, and this is sort of a Mel King question. He always asks, in whose voice and whose interest are we acting? And so again, when we use that word community, you draw a circle around any geography, there's lots of people who live there. There's going to be middle income people, low income people, immigrants, long-term residents, new residents. And sometimes you have to make some choices about which of the residents in the community you really want to serve and represent, especially when there are some conflicts. So don't take that for granted. I think one of the reasons we changed the CDC definition as the original one from the 70s, I think was written in an era where communities, neighborhoods were seen as more homogenous. And today we have neighborhoods that are really diverse. And so you can't just assume that because people live in the neighborhood, they share the same interests. And I think this is a helpful framework for thinking about how to engage community residents. This actually comes from the health space. This framework is used by hospitals and others in the public health sector, where they also have a strong belief in community participation. And it just sort of I think does a nice job explaining that there are different levels of resident and community engagement that you can use depending on the circumstances or the decision that you're making. From very low level, like we'll tell you what we're doing, to very high level in which, the institution, sort of hands off decision-making power to a group of residents, or through some electoral or democratic process. Sometimes, I think part of what smart community developers do is they think in what context and what situations where do they want to be on this continuum. I think this is later in the presentation, but I'll say now, if you're developing a workforce development program that's going to affect, 30, 40, 50 participants, you may not need as much community engagement in designing what the training program looks like. But if you're going to take a vacant lot and build something on that vacant lot, well, like lots of people really care and will be impacted by those choices. So you need to involve a lot of people. And once you build it, it's going to be there for 50 years, or 100 years. So it really matters. So you might want different levels of community engagement for different kinds of decision-making in the community. All right, let me pause there. If anybody has any questions or comments about kind of CDC's community development and sort of the role of community building, or how community building fits into that. Before we get into the next two sections, are economic development and housing. We're going to get more into the tactical, operational aspects of community development.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Please.
Who does CDC's respond to?
Well, I guess there's a couple levels to that. Hopefully I'm understanding the question right. But one level, obviously, a CDC has a board of directors, and under state law, that CDC's board of directors has to have meaningful representation from the community. It can't just be a bunch of, it has to reflect the community demographics. It has to include people who live and work in that community. So obviously, in any kind of nonprofit, the board is the ultimate decision maker. But community development corporations who do a good job, are engaging with other community-based organizations. They're engaging with local elected officials. They're creating mechanisms for the broader community to engage, whether that's through surveys or focus groups or house parties or community meetings. I mean, there's all sorts of different tactics for how to get a sense of what people in the community want. But I work on the assumption that different people in the community want different things. And so at a certain point, the CDC, like any other institution, has to make some decisions, even though those decisions might favor some people in the community and as opposed to others. I think my sense is that if you go through a process where people feel like their voice was heard and respected, they're more willing to live with an outcome that they didn't originally support than if you just sort of force it down them. I think that's how I'd answer that question. Does that, some of that, to be clear, is aspirational. I'm not suggesting that every single CDC, every single time, and every single community operates that way. So I think it's always important in this work and is to be kind of distinguish our aspirations and from day-to-day reality. I mean, that's true for each of us as individuals, right? We all have certain aspirations for how we're going to behave and conduct ourselves or what we're going to do. And we don't always meet those, but aspirationally, that's how I would answer that.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on community building? Or anyone want to speak to their own experience in that space? One of the reasons a lot of us still kind of cling to the idea of sort of a neighborhood level is just it's easier to do that in a more meaningful and deeper level in a smaller geographic space. So if you serve Roxbury, or if you serve the Main South neighborhood in Worcester, and there's 10, 15,000 people that live there, and they live within 2 square miles, and they share they all went to the, people go to the same schools and they go to the same stores. There's a sense of cohesion there that is tangible. If you're doing community development, and this is certainly true in some, parts of the country, across 5 counties, where from one end to the district could be a 2-hour drive across, empty farmlands, whatever, like it's harder to do that. It's just inherently harder to do that. And so as organizations grow and expand geographically, I think there's a fear that some of us have that we'll lose some of that community piece. Okay, we're coming up to another breakout soon, as I recall. Community economic development. So I think that's the name of this class, Intro to Community Economic Development. And the terms community development and community economic development are often used interchangeably. And I don't think there's any official difference between them. Most states, in many states, the term CED is used more often. In Massachusetts, it's not used so often. But that being said, I use them somewhat interchangeably, so just to be aware of that. But I do think there's a big difference between community economic development and sort of traditional economic development, the kind of economic development that you often hear about from elected officials and state leaders and so forth. And these are the key distinctions. And so when a community developer is engaged in economic development, again, ideally, aspirationally, we should be thinking about these issues here. So first of all, process. We keep coming back to that, but how the decision is made really matters. Not just whether it's a good decision or what the decision was. An intentional, explicit focus on low and moderate income people. Again, a lot of economic development has nothing to do about low income people. When you're building highways, or if you're working in the biotech industry, you know, elected officials might say, sure, there'll be some ancillary or trickle down benefits for low income people, but that's not really what the focus is. The focus is on creating more jobs or more wealth or more tax revenue. Community economic developers are always thinking about equity, not just growth. How do we share? How do we make sure that everyone's getting a fair share of what's being created, not simply growing more wealth? And again, most of the traditional economic development indicators are focused on growth, not equity. And so that's another thing we bring to the table. Here's this idea of democratizing ownership. You know, again, this is a little bit, maybe not, a little more controversial because it gets into that private versus shared wealth. But a lot of community economic development you'll see is about democratizing ownership. We care a lot about sustainability, both environmental sustainability, but also economic sustainability, getting out of these boom bust cycles that characterize so much of our economic life, where we have periods of rapid growth and then rapid decline. And typically low income people suffer both on the upswing and on the downswing. So a more stable growth is a better trajectory for low and moderate income people. And then this idea of local economies and kind of keeping money circulating in the local economy. You don't hear as much about this as you used to, but it is a fundamental principle that if people are working and shopping and spending money and transacting business with each other within a community, again, either physical or community of interest, that creates some economic synergies that we want to support. So there's a big emphasis in community development around if we're going to do a construction project, hiring local workers, hiring local firms to do the construction, to keep that economic money circulating in the community. Any questions on this? Hopefully this is resonating for some of you. So there's 7 different ways that community developers try to do this, community economic development. When I started teaching this class, I think I had 4, but I've added a few over time. And here's a list, and we're just going to spend a minute on each of these, or a couple of minutes on each of these. Please, you know, again, just use the chat if I'm going too fast or something strikes you as a little off, or any kind of questions like that. And if I don't see it, Leah will, and we'll stop. So real estate development is what we're most known for in many ways. And to the degree we are working in physical places, then obviously real estate defines what that physical space looks like. So this can include housing, commercial development, mixed use, which means housing and commercial in the same building, brownfields, which is where we use for contaminated land. A lot of urban areas in particular, land remains vacant because it's contaminated and it's not safe to build. And until it gets cleaned up, you can't build. So a lot of focus on that. Addressing the issue of food deserts is another real estate related issue, which is that many neighborhoods, residents don't have access to good, healthy food at a reasonable price. So building supermarkets and making sure that there's an opportunity for that. And then there's a lot of talk, especially in the greater Boston area, about equitable transit-oriented development, building housing, mixed income and affordable housing near transit, because the people who most depend on transit are obviously low and moderate income people who can't afford a car. So, and at the same time, without intention, if you just let the market decide what gets built near transit, you're going to end up with a lot of high income housing, because while high income people may not need transit, a lot of them like transit and like to have easy access to it. So any questions on the real estate? That makes sense. It's probably what you most think of and associate with community developers. Probably the next most common activity for community developers when it comes to economic development is in the small and micro business space. And when we use the term small business, we're talking probably, 1 employee, 2 employees, maybe 5 or 10 or 15. When the federal government says small business, they usually say 500 employees or less, but we're talking more like 10 to 20 or less. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, a healthy neighborhood is going to have a vibrant local small business community. I mean, that's just what characterizes a healthy community. So there's a community building aspect to this, but also entrepreneurship is an important way that people have built wealth over time. That's how my grandparents, established themselves in this country, was by starting a business. And you see obviously a lot of immigrant communities, that's how they get their foot in the door. So supporting that is really important, and there's a lot of challenges to starting a business. So CDCs and others, and I know some of you on this phone, offer training programs or one-on-one technical assistance. A lot of entrepreneurs that we work with are not able to get loans from banks. They don't have the collateral, they don't have the assets. So they need specialized lending products, often with public or philanthropic dollars used to reduce the risk. Also, you see more and more of these idea of like creating incubators where a nonprofit creates a physical space where businesses can come and get started, get some technical assistance, have a low rent place to start building out their business, and then they can expand from there. Accelerators are another sort of similar idea where you're trying to concentrate support on a new business to help it accelerate its growth. And then other things you can do, help small businesses access markets, both with universities, with hospitals, with government agencies. And then you see a focus on business district revitalization to try to make sure that you're getting a lot of foot traffic in your local neighborhood business district. So in Boston, that's usually done by Main Streets organizations, not the CDCs, but in other places, it's a community development corporation or some kind of community development group that's doing that. You with me so far? Are any of your organizations involved in this kind of business development? Anyone doing this work? I'm gonna look at page 2 of my screen.
Yeah. We do this. We have loan programs. We sub out technical assistance for small businesses. We just ran an emergency loan program for COVID. Hoping to figure out how to start an incubator.
Okay. Well, good. One of the things
it's generating the community capacity to do it is kind of the struggle.
Meaning there's no organization in Chelsea that has the skill sets to do this work right now? Is that what you mean?
Competently. Competently.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things about all of this work, but in particular here, that if you're going to hang out your shingle and say, hey, we're here to help you start your business or help you write a business plan or a marketing plan or to do financing, you better know what you're doing because that business owner is putting his or her life on the line in many ways. You know, they may be taking all of their savings and putting it into that business. And if you lead them down the wrong path, you know, you're doing more harm than good. And, you know, starting a business is hard. It's a competitive environment. So, you know, I think it is important that if an organization is going to offer these services, that they have the qualified staff and to do it well and to do it properly. And, you know,
Yeah.
this is one
No,
of those cases. Go ahead, Carl.
We just went through a planning exercise that Mass Gaming Commission funded to build out an enterprise center at Bunker Hill Community College. But, you know, finding a funding stream to make them viable over the long term is a real challenge.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about this when we get into the housing section. You know, one of the beautiful things about real estate is if you do it well, you can make money and sustain that over time. There's sort of a business model over time for generating revenue. A lot of these programs, you really need to do fundraising every year. You need to get government contracts every year. You can maybe make a little bit money on the lending, but honestly, not very much. So it's a different kind of operation. But, you know, when we think about the sort of community wealth versus private wealth, this is a part of the community development space, which tends to be focused a little bit more around helping individuals start a business, build some wealth through that. Some CDCs are working with co-op businesses, but not as much as maybe you'd think. So pressing ahead, and this, I didn't even remember this was the next slide, but there's a whole literature and movement around the idea of community wealth building, rooted in sort of this idea of a worker co-op. And just for those who don't know, worker co-op is basically a business in which the workers are the owners, or some of the workers are the owners. And as the business makes money, the workers gain that wealth and those assets. And it's a terrific way to for a lot of people to share in the wealth of an enterprise, and often they come along with democratic decision-making about the company. It certainly means the company is less likely to sell out to a big corporation or move to a new location. And then consumer co-ops, similar idea, but here it's the consumers, not the workers, who own the enterprise. So you see that with a lot of food co-ops and community-owned stores. Social enterprises are essentially nonprofits that are running a business, like the Haley House in Roxbury, I believe, is a nonprofit, a coffee shop and cafe. So they're using a business model to generate revenue, but they do so but their mission is to, create a service for the community. They also do some job training programs, things like that. But again, it's sort of a socially owned business. Benefit corporations are a new thing. They're private for-profit entities who have a explicit social purpose. And the idea is that the investors in these companies can't sue if the company makes a decision that is socially motivated and not profit motivated. And then a lot of interest these days in anchor institutions, by which we mean hospitals and universities, and maybe even museums. But hospitals and universities are physically located in a place. They are very unlikely to leave that place. Harvard is not leaving Cambridge. BU is not leaving Boston. And so they're here. They are community institutions. They are nonprofits. They have a tremendous amount of wealth. They generate a tremendous amount of economic activity in that place. And so the idea is, if we can get them to engage with local residents, low and moderate income people will be able to more benefit from all of the wealth and economic activity they generate and that they're involved in. And because they're not moving, hence the term anchor. So there's a lot of effort around that, and a lot of institutions are trying to think more intentionally about hiring companies that are locally based, hiring workers from the local community, thinking about their real estate expansion in a way that's a little more respectful of the local community, that kind of thing. Workforce development, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think, people have at least a general idea that, in our complex economy, people need skills to get a lot of the jobs. A lot of nonprofits are involved in helping people access those schools. Not that many place-based community groups offer workforce development programs because they're not inherently place-based. If you want to get a training on how to be a X-ray technician, doesn't really matter where you live. There's only so many people in any particular neighborhood who want training in X-ray technician. It's probably better to offer that kind of training across a broad region so you have enough students over time and there's enough people to pull from, and you can build the expertise to run that training program effectively. So those place-based organizations who are involved in workforce development are often acting more as sort of intermediaries to help people in their community access regionally provided workforce programs. But obviously, at the end of the day, you can't have economic development without a job.
So I just wanted to reframe this slightly. I
Sure.
spent a lot of time working in workforce development now, but looking at it through the public health lens has helped frame it much better. So one of the key social determinants of health is economic stability and mobility. And reframing workforce development as economic stability and mobility has helped certainly the community understand it better, and also, I guess, all of the stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, yeah, those connections, which don't have time to get into too much today, are certainly more evident than ever before and attracting, I think, more attention to this field, which is one of the big opportunities going forward. So the whole aspect of idea of financial education and capacity building, the way I think about this is that for many years, CDCs and other nonprofits were trying to help people buy a home because obviously home ownership is, part of the American dream, and it's a big financial investment. So there were a whole bunch of programs and offerings to help people buy homes. And what organizations were finding is a lot of folks, what was preventing them from buying a home is they had other kinds of financial problems in their lives, credit card debt, student debt, healthcare debt, that was preventing them from moving forward. And sometimes, life happens and you get into trouble, but sometimes you're the victim of a lot of predatory schemes that are out there, and a lot of ways in which our complex financial world makes it more difficult and more expensive for low-income people to function. This became particularly evident in the last recession when we saw so many families victimized by predatory financial products. And so kind of emerging out of that, there's been a huge emphasis, an increased emphasis on making sure that low and moderate income people really have a deep understanding of how financial products and financial systems work, how to access a bank, why you want to have a banking relationship and not rely on check cashers, how to avoid scammers and schemers, and how to really be proactive in thinking about your financial life and building, a budget and goals and so forth. And part of the insight around this was also that while income and increasing incomes is really important, ultimately people do need to have some wealth, some savings, some cushion. I think there's some statistic out there, like half of the people in America don't have $400, wouldn't be able to deal with a $400 emergency. I forget exactly how that stat works, but it's pretty stunning. And so helping people save money, even if they're low income, helping them put a little bit of money away each month has been another big focus of this. that's what these idea of these match savings accounts, where if somebody saves $25 a month, the government or the nonprofit will match that with another $2 or $3 for every dollar. So people have more of an incentive to save up and can achieve greater savings over time. Benefit maximization refers to the idea that many people are eligible for things like food stamps, but don't access them because they don't know or they don't know how. So making sure people are getting all of their benefits is a way to ensure that they're as financially secure as possible. And one of my favorite programs is the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, where, as I think people know, when you get a subsidized apartment, often you pay 30% of your income for rent. That's what's deemed affordable. But that means if your income goes up, your rent goes up. And so for every additional dollar you make, if 30 cents is going to rent and 10 cents, 15, 20 cents are going to taxes, it's a pretty powerful disincentive to make more money. And it makes it hard to save money if every time you make more, you're losing more to rent. So the federal government created this program. And what it means is as your income goes up and as your rent goes up, all of the increased rent goes into a savings account so that over time people can save a lot of money. So if you're enroll in the program and you're making $20,000 a year and now you're making $30,000 a year, your income went up $10,000, your rent went up $3,000. Instead of that $3,000 going to the landlord, it's going to go to an escrow account for that family. And over a few years, that $3,000 can become $6,000, $9,000, $12,000. And now this family that's living in subsidized housing has a financial cushion that they can use to improve their lives. So that's a great program. And it's sort of in this spirit of sort of helping to break the cycle of people, just trying to get to the end of the month. This has become a big focus. And again, it's more on the individual side than on the community side. And it shows that community developers now are really working in both spaces and trying to do a both and with community wealth and individual financial security. And then I think this is my last one. To me, if you're a community developer and you should be about advocacy all the time. Fighting for your neighborhood, fighting for your community. Even if you're not going to run the program yourself, there are things you can do to advocate that the residents you care about and the people you care about and the people you serve have access to other economic opportunities. So you'll see a lot of CDCs and community development organizations that are involved in trying to expand transit in their community, because not that the CDC or the nonprofit's going to run the transit, but better transit's going to mean better opportunities for people, notwithstanding what Carl and others were saying earlier about gentrification, like, acknowledging that tension. But I think community developers should see themselves as more than just program operators, but also as, part of the building power and advocating for the community. So that was a lot, 7 types of economic development. You probably could slice and dice it more. So we're going to take a pause here, go into small groups. I think what I want to do is do the small group discussion, come back, reflect on that, then take a real break, and then we'll do housing after the break. So in your small groups, share a little bit about what your particular organization might be doing in this space, if anything. What you wish your organization would do that it maybe isn't currently, but if it's not doing one of these 7 things you think it should. Or if there's some piece of economic development that you think is missing from my list, I'm always happy to add an 8th. Like I said, I started out with 4. Any questions before we go into small groups? You still with me? It's hard to read this. It's hard to read. Okay. All right, Leah, let's give this like 6 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. Does folks share a little bit about what they discussed in their breakouts or any questions that emerged? Always happy to have people argue with me. Since you learned nothing yet so far, one key takeaway is there are no hard and fast definitions or rules about any of this. We're all making them up as we go.
I guess in talking about it, one of the things that I realized is the importance of coalitions, and particularly for CDCs, they don't have to do everything, but they should be working with other organizations or building capacity in the community to create new organizations to fill in the gaps in that landscape.
Yeah. Well, we're, if I move fast enough, we'll have time, but there's, when we start thinking about comprehensive community development, working across multiple sectors, because obviously at the end of the day, healthy communities require good housing, good jobs, good local businesses, good schools, good healthcare, good parks, good transportation. You can't pick and choose. And while no one organization can do all of those things well, an effective civic environment is gonna produce good quality results in all those areas. And so partnership and collaboration and advocacy are actually really core skill sets for community developers to have, because you're going to do some things, other folks are going to do some stuff. And there's a vision of community development in which, community stakeholders come together, kind of come up with an overall community plan, and then divvy up the work and hold each other accountable. It's never quite so neat and simple.
No,
But
you can
fundamentally, that's sort of, community development at its highest and most effective level starts to look like that, where there's some process where, we're going to do some affordable housing here. You're going to open up a health center. You're going to provide some youth programming. You're going to do some, green space development, et cetera. And there's some explicit discussion about that.
Yeah, but it can also develop into turf wars.
Yes.
As everyone's chasing what limited funding streams there are.
Well, nonprofits like anyone else, whether it's an individual or business, have to worry about their financial future, and some activities are more profitable than others. And I know we have a few accountants on the phone on the call, and I'm sure they see this in that certain business lines can generate quite a big profit for an organization and others don't. And so it's always part of the conversation and thinking about how we're going to divvy up the work and share the resources that might get generated. But really one of the most powerful things about community development, and we're about to move into the housing section, is the power of land and real estate ownership. And basically you go back as far as you can in Western civilization anyhow, and land ownership and power go hand in hand. And there's good reasons for that, or bad reasons for that too, I suppose. But real estate can generate money. Most things take money. Real estate actually has the ability to generate money, and it's a weird thing, and maybe it's a function of a messed up economic system, but that is our system. So that ends up playing a big role in community development. So any other thoughts on economic development, community economic development?
I have a comment just kind of on what you just said, where, some segments are more profitable than others. And, the real estate side is definitely more profitable. But when you take a look at the small business and what agencies are doing to help their community, I have a CDC that has a whole segment of giving small business loans. But you take a look at what happened with COVID, and that is, they're losing a lot of money right now because those folks aren't able to pay back their funds. So you have to really take a look at, well, are we going to do what's going to make us money, or are we going to stick to what our true beliefs are and continue to help the community even if we're not going to see a return on it?
Yeah, I mean, those are tough decisions. And one of the things that we as an advocacy organization have tried to do over time is create more flexible funding streams so that it's not the funder who's dictating the activity, but the community. And the community investment tax credit was built for that explicit purpose, as one example. And when I did an executive, leadership program once, and they talked about the nonprofit vendorism, where nonprofits sort of get into this habit and culture of, sort of chasing the latest grant opportunity. And it requires a lot of discipline to avoid that and stay focused and allocate your resources as best you can within the realities. And I see someone raised this in the chat about how is the remote virtual world going to change all this once we get out of this pandemic? And it is a really important question, and one that I wish we were spending more time thinking about as a field, and maybe we will when we get the chance to breathe about it. The whole nature of work could be changing. The way services are delivered is going to change. In many ways, I think those of us who believe in place-based delivery of services should be worried that a lot of services are going to be delivered in this format going forward. If you want to take a home ownership class, you don't need to take it from a local community group. You could take it from anybody, anywhere, anytime. And so I think for nonprofits who think about the services they deliver and which services have to be offered in a physical place that's proximate to the people, that's going to change. And I think it's going to change forever. And it won't be completely gone, but in terms of how it affects your revenue models, how it affects your participation numbers, that's a big deal. Now, it also creates opportunities for collaboration and partnership, and we're seeing a lot of that, where nonprofits can share content and share instructors, and you can bring people in from all over the world to help you instantly. So it's either frightening or exciting, depending on how you look at it. But it is going to be different. It is, there's just no way we're just going to completely revert back to the old models. So let's take a 10-minute break. Let's see, it's come back at quarter of about the role of housing in community development. And there's a reason I used to do housing first and then the economic development piece. And I flipped it because I think many people wrongly conflate housing and community development as if it's the same thing, or think that housing is the end all and be all of community development. And sometimes you'll hear people criticize CDCs as being too focused on housing. So I like to do the economic development piece first because I think it tries to emphasize that housing is one of the things that community developers do, not the only thing. But you see that connection in lots of places. For example, the Department of Housing and Community Development. Lots of public agencies have that name. And the two fields are so closely intertwined that they do sometimes kind of come together in ways that can be confusing. But there's a reason why housing and community development are so closely connected, because housing is really super important if you care about community development. And we are going to talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about housing, and then we're going to kind of lead that into community development and how housing relates to community development. But just to sort of at a high level, I think it's important to note that housing in America has evolved and changed over time. The way it is today is not the way it's always been. So one key trend over the last 100 years is housing quality has improved dramatically, from plumbing to electricity to safety to less crowding and all the rest. Perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, housing affordability has gotten worse, especially over the last 30 years. And I think that there's a lot of theory as to why the last 30 years we've seen such a divergence, but I think it has a lot to do with changing income, growing income and wealth inequality manifesting itself in the housing space, but also in many locations, an inadequate supply of housing. So you see that really taking off in the last 30 years. Housing markets are so different from place to place across the country and even across Massachusetts, it's hard to believe it's the same country. There are places where you can't buy a house for less than $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, and there's places where you can buy a house for $50,000 or $75,000. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I mentioned I grew up in Syracuse. The house I grew up in, I just looked it up. It's worth $180,000. It's a 3-bedroom, single-family house with a nice yard, and it's worth $180,000. And It's bigger than the house I live in now, and it's obviously worth a lot less. So it's just dramatic. And that really makes federal housing policy challenging because it's hard to create policies that make sense for such different housing markets. 2/3 of Americans live in a house they own. 2/3. So every single one of those homeowners has a financial interest in seeing housing prices go up. So sometimes you wonder, like why is housing policy so messed up? Well, for many, many people, it's actually not messed up. It's doing what we want it to do, which is increase property values. So my house is worth more so that when I retire and I sell my house, it's worth as much money as possible. That is just really important to keep in mind. And for community developers in many neighborhoods, it's a goal of community development to lift property values because they are so low that it's a problem. But nonetheless, it's not how we think about it in Greater Boston all that often. The affordable housing industry, the entire affordable housing world, public housing, Section 8 housing, low-income housing tax credits, inclusionary development housing, all of it combined serves about 1 out of 4 eligible households, maybe 1 out of 5. So a lot of what ends up happening is deciding who's the one that gets it and who are the 3 that don't get it. A lot of policy is based on trying to decide how to allocate this scarce resource of 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5. And again, that creates sort of a dysfunctional and bizarre conversation sometimes. We have had racial segregation in our housing markets for a long time, and it persists to this day. There's been a lot of talk about that in recent years because of the great book, The Color of Law, which documents that residential segregation was intentionally created. And once it's in place, it's hard to dismantle. And so you see that trend today. And as I mentioned earlier, income and wealth inequality, which is driven by things in our labor markets, is reinforcing a lot of the dysfunction in our housing market. So those two things are intertwined. There's 3 recurring themes when we think about housing policy and housing action. And one is that the decisions we make today are going to be with us for decades and decades and decades. I just mentioned, we're living with the legacy of housing discrimination from 50 and 100 years ago. The house I live in was built in 1927. Somebody made a decision in 1927 or maybe 1926 to put a house on this piece of land. And that decision still affects this neighborhood today. May have been a great decision, may have been a bad decision, but that decision made by somebody in 1926 still impacts this entire neighborhood, who gets to live here, the quality of life in this neighborhood. It's kind of amazing. So when people fight about what we should build, when people have strong opinions about whether we should build A or B, the stakes are really high. The legacy of that decision is going to be a long time. Housing policy is never about housing alone, and we're going to talk about this in a second. There's always other things going on because housing affects everything else. And 3, there's always politics. Different stakeholders have different interests, and when you look at housing policy and try to understand housing policy and housing programs, you have to remember that it is the reflection of a political debate among stakeholders with different interests. And so sometimes it looks a little funny because it is a little funny. So what are we trying to achieve with housing policy? We talked about this from community development, but I think it's always really important to say, what's our goal? How are we going to measure success if we don't know what our goals are? And once again, there are a lot of different housing goals. We're trying to do a lot of different things because, again, housing is so critical and so important. So at its most basic level, we're trying to provide physical safety and a physical shelter for humans. I mean, it goes back to the beginning of human existence, right? We're trying to preserve existing homes and expand the supply of good quality homes. We're trying to make housing more affordable. Some of us are anyhow. Some of us are trying to promote racial and economic diversity. Others might be trying to prevent racial and economic diversity, but that's part of what people are thinking about. Sorry, I gotta close this door. A lot of folks think about housing as a path toward wealth. And so we think of housing policy as a way to build family wealth through home ownership. There's nothing to do necessarily with the physical entity itself. We see housing as a way to strengthen and support families. Housing is often a pathway to various kinds of supportive services, especially for people with disabilities and elderly people. We often combine the services in the housing. It's about metropolitan growth. It's about growing the economy. A lot of different things here. Those things may not all line up to result in the same approach. And it's not the whole list. There are other considerations. There's unions and construction firms and construction workers who are focused on job creation. There's a whole environmental impact about where we build what housing and who gets to live there that affects climate change and the environment. A lot of conversation about preserving community character. That, you know, people move into a place because they like the way the place feels, and so they don't want to see it change. And that's not just true in suburban or rural areas. That's true in urban areas too. It's true in every community. You know, many of us choose a place, and so that if that place changes, you know, that's upsetting. There's a whole financial industry that has a stake in real estate, investors, bankers, and so forth. So they have a certain lens, they're looking at it. It's an opportunity for business development for minority and women-owned businesses. Somebody mentioned earlier the connection between housing and health. We've seen that with COVID. Overcrowded housing results in more virus infections. More housing can lead to lead poisoning. It can lead to asthma and other health impacts. In some places, we're trying to use housing to deal with blight and vacant land. We're trying to fill in vacant land because vacant land can create all sorts of problems for neighborhood residents. And in other places, we're trying to use housing to try to slow and mitigate gentrification. So my point is not that you remember all these different things, and hopefully a lot of these things kind of resonate, at least when you see them on the list. The point is that decisions around housing and housing policy, or what to build on any particular piece of land at a particular moment in time, is all of these different goals are colliding. And community developers, if you want to be involved in housing development or housing policy or housing interventions, you know, are going to have to navigate through this maze of all these different considerations and be aware that different constituencies are thinking about different things. So when you say, well, we need more affordable housing and that's why we should build this, somebody else might be saying, yes, but what I care about is job creation, or what I care about is increasing property values or increasing tax revenue. I didn't even put tax revenue on here. I need to add that since municipalities rely on property tax revenue to fund their schools. So it's complicated. Anything else? I forgot tax revenue. I got to add that. What else did I do? Anything else that seems glaringly missing? Does it seem like a lot? Is it too many things? All right. So how do we influence housing markets? This is definitely not a free market. There is lots of public policy that shapes housing. So obviously one way you do it, especially from an affordable housing standpoint, is you provide a subsidy. The government, taxpayers pay a portion of the costs. You can do that by giving away money. You can do that by giving tax breaks. Another huge area is around land zoning and land use regulation. The government tells you what you can and can't build on any particular piece of land. And obviously then that affects what gets built. We have all sorts of regulation on the lenders and brokers and landlords and other industry professionals. Policy can focus on rental housing or home ownership, or these hybrid models that we'll talk about in a minute. Then you have these different stakeholders that are in play. And then there's sort of supply and demand side approaches. Do we increase the supply of units as a way to reduce the pressure and reduce prices, or do we focus on demand side approaches, basically helping people by giving them more money so they can purchase more housing in the marketplace, down payment assistance grants for home buyers, or rental subsidies for renters? There's different ways to go at it. This is a good thing because the more tools you have, arguably, the more different ways you can achieve the goals that you've identified. So why is housing so central to community development? Why is it like so conflated with community development? Well, there's good reasons. Housing pretty much shapes who gets to live. And if we care about people and places, and housing is really where those two things come together. What kind of housing determines who gets to live there? If it's all large single family homes, you can have a certain population. If there's more of a mix of housing stock, you can have a more mixed population. And then that in turn influences what kinds of stores you have, what kinds of neighborhood amenities, and all the rest. Another reason why it's so central is the community development movement really emerged as a response to urban renewal. And we didn't have time to go into this. You'll see this in the Madison Park video. But after World War II, the federal government saw that there were many neighborhoods with very low quality housing, a lot of old housing that was falling apart, a lot of really dense and overcrowded housing. There was a big effort to help people move to the suburbs. As that happened, inner city neighborhoods are really struggling. And so the federal response to that was urban renewal. Knock things down, build new stuff, keep it simple. That obviously upset a lot of people, and community development was really the community response to that approach of top down, knock everything down, move everybody out, create a new place. Because urban renewal was so focused on housing, community development then was focused on an alternative vision for how to improve housing stock. And it wasn't that the federal government was wrong after World War II that these neighborhoods needed investment. They did. They had very old housing from the turn of the century. They were overcrowded. There did need to be investment. They just went about it the wrong way often. Another reason housing is central to community development is that it affects virtually every aspect of people's lives and the opportunities they have. It affects where they go to school. It affects, unfortunately, the quality of the school they go to. It affects their access to jobs and employment and transit. It can determine and impact your health, public safety. So housing is really the pathway to all these other social benefits and social goals that we have. And then you see the others. It just the big impact on the neighborhood. So in short, I like to say housing, it doesn't just affect the people who live in the house, but it affects all of the neighbors around the house. So each house has an impact on a lot of people, even if there's only one family that maybe lives inside. So the challenge for a community developer is to deal with all of that housing stuff, which is hard enough. If all you cared about was housing, that would be hard. But for a community developer, you have to say, okay, how do we think about housing in the context of what we're trying to build in this place, in this community? How is housing going to interact with all these other things that we're trying to accomplish, all these goals we talked about earlier? And so I've increasingly thought about this from the standpoint of how do we think about housing from a community development perspective? And that's what I want to talk about today. So I want you guys to think a little bit in small groups about what might be some of the tensions between a community developer's goals and how housing, how the housing industry or how the housing policy world thinks about it. And if you work for an organization that's involved in housing development, maybe you've seen some of these examples where you've wanted to do something, but you couldn't find the way to do it because the policies and programs kind of prevented you. So let's try that in small groups, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it and how to overcome those obstacles and tensions. Okay, so just 5 excellent examples.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I just want to flag Abby's asking why that might be. That.
Mhm.
Yeah. If you can.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons, but probably the principal one is that affordable housing policy is oriented toward low-income people, and low-income people tend to be in rental housing. And I would say over the last 30, 40 years, even more of a focus on extremely low income and very low income. Part of that is because of our terrible homelessness problem. part of it is because of effective advocacy by groups to say, hey, the dollars need to go to the lowest income people. Like, why would you help somebody who makes $60,000 a year when there's people that are $30,000 a year who need help more? And it's hard to argue with that. But if you look at like public housing in our country, you know, after World War II, public housing residents were a much broader mix of incomes. A lot more middle income people were living in public housing. And over time, it became housing really for extremely low income people, which is part of the reason why it gets neglected by policymakers. So I would say that's probably the biggest reason. Another issue I will say that in Massachusetts, probably other states too, there were some home ownership developments that really got financially blown up by the recession in 2010, and that really scared off the Commonwealth of Massachusetts from doing home ownership for many years because they were afraid of the ups and downs of the home ownership market. They've kind of overcome that, but that was another factor. The biggest, oh, go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, so a frustration for me has always been, you know, you think the more people you get out of rental housing, then the more you clear up for folks who need it. Like, yep. I live in Quincy. I personally make 70,000. That's pretty good. My partner makes 40,000. But can we afford to purchase a home in Quincy, which is $500,000-$600,000 for a 1-bathroom? You know, it's where's the down payment coming for that? When we could save, obviously, we're middle income, but it's still so far out of reach. And I know in other parts of the country, you know, they don't have those problems. Like a $10,000 down payment is great, and you're fine. But in Mass, it's just, it's so far out of reach. And, you know, they're not creating these programs to get folks who can afford it into home ownership. You're never going to clear up those rental spots for people who need it. So.
Yeah, no, I think, and that problem has become much more severe over the last 20, 30 years as those gaps have grown wider and wider, that for people to move out of subsidized housing is such a leap that it's almost impossible to make. And then it backs up the pipeline, if you will, for other families to move in. And, you know, most cases, once you get a subsidized apartment, you're there for as long as you want to be there, assuming you pay the rent and, you know, follow the rules. And, you know, even though there's 3 other households that would love to have that place. So creating a continuum of housing products and housing availability across incomes as you go up the ladder is very much how community developers think about it. But the affordable housing industry, which is focused on helping the poorest of the poor avoid homelessness, appropriately so, that's not how they think about it. So again, it's not like there's a right or a wrong necessarily, but it is a tension. It's a tension that's driven by scarcity. You know, I always want to remind people that if we made a decision as a society that we were going to invest in this in a robust way, then a lot of these tensions go away. But so that's always the first thing. It's different goals, and often what's really hard are different legitimate goals in the fight over limited dollars. Again, some people think about housing very much from a household. We want to serve people with AIDS. We want to serve people with disabilities. We want to serve seniors. We want to serve families. We want to serve young adults, you know, different population sets, versus thinking about, well, we want to try to do this housing development in a way that's going to create the whole neighborhood that we're trying to build, which is a diverse, mixed income, vibrant neighborhood. And so that's a different way of looking at it. There's a whole bunch of folks who think about housing in terms of, again, from a community development standpoint, how do we improve the housing stock in this neighborhood? How do we create a neighborhood mix that is healthy and vibrant? And other folks are thinking about housing policy. How do we help low-income people move out of poor neighborhoods into quote unquote better neighborhoods? Tremendous amount of policy and initiative to try to help people move to another place. And because folks have been prevented from moving into a lot of those places through discrimination and so forth, you know, it makes sense. Like, why shouldn't low-income people be able to live in whatever town they want to live in? Absolutely, they should be. But programs and policies designed to help people move are different than programs and policies that are designed to help people who live here stay here. And so that's another tension. We've talked about the wealth stuff, so we won't do that again. We talked about the income targeting. Sometimes there's just competing for resources between preserving existing affordable housing and creating new. There's some tension between, it's much more economical from an affordable housing standpoint to build a large building. But not every neighborhood wants to have a large building. Some sites don't want to accommodate a large building. And so the right community development response is to build a small building with maybe 8 or 15 units, not a 50-unit building. But if the affordable housing industry is designed to create 50-unit buildings, now you're in trouble, and you can't do what the community wants. And then there's this whole tension about who gets to do the housing. Should it be for-profit companies, nonprofits, big groups, small groups? Again, community development perspective, community ownership, nonprofit driven, that whole thing. But that may not be the most important criteria for others.
Joe, I just want to cut in for a sec. I know I saw that Josh raised his hand, and there's also a question in the chat.
Oh, okay, Josh, go ahead. Sorry.
It was just on an earlier point about basically housing development incentives towards rental or home ownership. I work for CED in the housing development division, so we take in a lot of these proposals in the state. It was, I think, the 1960s, as recently as then, where in part of the post-war boom, in certain parts of the country, particularly greater New York, extending to Long Island, that if you had enough money to make a down payment, your mortgage was cheaper than the average rent. And of course, if you fast forward to now, that sounds laughable because it's so not the case anymore. So if you consider renting as a part of the ladder towards home ownership, you pay for a while, you save the rest of your discretionary. Here in Boston, that's essentially not possible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So you combine this with sort of market incentives towards building rental. And a great part of that is simply, in many ways, it's easier to scale at this current time. It's easier to put up 100 units of rental than 100 units of home ownership. There's also greater incentives for developers, a better bottom line, whether that's market or affordable.
Yep.
So housing being more than three-dimensional, these are just part of the complexities that are always in motion.
Yep.
That, especially from my vantage point, we're always trying to kind of juggle that and balance it at the same time.
Yeah, good, 100%. And then just to pick up on Dorothy's comment in the chat here, and it's sort of related to this, but when you think about displacement, people, the response from some in my industry, some housers is, well, if we have a lot of displacement going on, say in a hot market neighborhood, it's because there's not enough housing there. If we build more housing, it'll take some of the pressure off and there'll be less displacement. And then the response from tenant advocates is no, that new housing is going to be expensive. It's going to draw in even more higher income people. And then we might say, okay, yeah, but 20% of the units will be affordable and we'll have 50 new affordable units in the neighborhood. The problem is those 50 affordable units aren't going to go to people who live in the neighborhood, not necessarily anyhow. Fair housing laws require you market to anybody and everybody. Folks could move in from other places and have every right to do so. So people, when they're facing displacement from an existing apartment, not a future apartment that hasn't been built yet. And so one of the things that a lot of us have been advocating for, and again, from a community development standpoint would make sense, is helping nonprofits buy existing rental apartments and preserving them as affordable for the long term, because now you're preventing displacement from people who live in a particular building. The affordable housing system is not really set up to do that or do that at scale, and it's complicated. Much more to the liking of the affordable housing system is to build a brand new building from scratch, and you can build a nice modern facility. But if our priorities are the community priorities, we might think about it differently. So I think that's another example of where, in the context of gentrification and displacement, the traditional affordable housing response may not quite meet the need as directly as we'd like. Okay. So I got to keep moving because we got to cover some stuff and we will start to run out of time. So there's lots of ways that CDCs and community developers can intervene in the housing market to try to address some of the goals and objectives that we have. Building buildings is certainly one of them. And building buildings that have restrictions on the rents is obviously like at the core of it. And there are ways to make money on that. We're not going to get into that today. We have other classes at the King Institute that will tell you how to make money doing that. And then there's the home ownership, which is, again, much smaller proportion of what we do, but we do some of it. There's a lot of affordable housing in Massachusetts already. It takes a lot of effort to keep it affordable, to keep it in good physical condition. So again, that's a big part of what we might do. I just mentioned acquiring existing affordable apartments. But then there's a whole set of activities around home ownership. Not so much building home ownership units, but helping people with home buyer education, helping people access mortgage products that they can afford, subsidized mortgage products, down payment assistance programs to overcome the issue that Josh is describing. And then on the back end, foreclosure prevention counseling, which was a big focus 10 years ago. And I worry that this current recession might require renewed attention on foreclosure prevention. You see a lot of community developers focus on homeowner repairs in neighborhoods where the housing stock is old and in bad repair and underinvested. The right intervention is to fix up the existing stock. You don't necessarily need more housing. We need to fix up what we have. I was just talking to the state rep from Worcester yesterday, and they've had a spate of fires in their neighborhood because there's a lot of vacant properties, and those are fire hazards. And a firefighter recently passed away in Worcester in one of those. So huge concern there, getting these properties fixed up. Advocacy and organizing on behalf and with tenants is another piece, another way we can intervene in the housing market. There's regulation and advocating for regulations to control the housing market. So there are lots of different ways that community developers can try to shape housing markets so that in this particular neighborhood, you have the kind of balance and diversity that you're seeking. I think I already covered a lot of this, but housing markets are both an indicator of overall neighborhood health and a driver of neighborhood health. In a neighborhood where you have jobs and stores, and parks and infrastructure, you're going to see stronger housing markets and the housing and more investment in the housing stock, and that's a good thing until it's not. And in a unhealthy neighborhood, in a place where the housing market is weak, you're also usually going to see, more vacant storefronts, parks that are not as well maintained, the tax base is lower. So at the end of the day, community development is really about trying to find that balance of not too hot and not too soft, the Goldilocks thing, of trying to find that. And it's really hard. Housing markets tend to move in one direction or the other. It's hard to have stability. It's hard to achieve a balance, and then it's hard to keep a balance. But in my mind, that's sort of what community developers are working toward. Okay, this is kind of redundant. I don't need this slide. So what do you do when you're in a weak market? So if you're a community developer in Fall River or Holyoke, parts of Worcester, Fitchburg, et cetera, you're trying to think like, okay, we've got a lot of vacant property. We have a lot of blighted property. We have a lot of underinvested properties. We have a lot of low-income people, some concentrated poverty. What do we do? And here you're going to want to focus on reducing property abandonment, getting properties repaired. You may need to attack some of the non-housing related things that are holding back the market, including public safety and crime, a lot of absentee landlords coming in and not investing in their properties. And on the other hand, if you can improve some of the neighborhood amenities, if you can increase the home ownership rate, we have neighborhoods with home ownership rates of like 10%. And again, nationwide, it's 2/3. In Boston, which has a lot of rental housing, it's 1/3. But if you're in a neighborhood where only 10% of the people own their own home and 90% of the housing stock is owned by investors, you're likely to see some of this disrepair it's problematic. What do you do if you're in a strong market? You do different things. That's really the fundamental point here, is that what the community developer should do is, in terms of housing interventions, should be based on what the market.
I just want to show you.
Does someone have a question or no? So here, you know, what you're trying to stop in a hot market is folks in buying naturally occurring affordable housing and upscaling it. You know, we're seeing that in Mattapan in a couple of cases right now. You're seeing a lot of corporate investors coming into neighborhoods because they see opportunity to extract wealth. And what do you need to do? You need to build a lot more affordable housing in these neighborhoods. You need to acquire what naturally occurring affordable housing is left. You probably need to have robust tenant organizing and advocacy. You want inclusionary development. Again, you want these other interventions that are going to hopefully mitigate and slow the market down a little bit. A couple of things that people still don't agree about is whether building more housing or helps or hurts in a hot market. It might help at a regional level and hurt at the neighborhood level. It might depend on what's being built, but you know, there's a lot of debate between different constituencies right now. And I don't want to weigh into that here, but if you're doing community development and housing in a strong market, I'm sure you're familiar with this. And then I think Carl raised this earlier, in a weak market, what happens if we do improve the park or the schools or do bring in new investment? I remember when I was working on the Community Preservation Act campaign in Boston in 2016, speaking to a community group about how this was going to create money to improve the parks. And someone said, I don't want to improve the parks. If we improve the parks, it'll increase housing prices. And, you know, that's a heartbreaking thing to have to, you know, to think about. You know, do we have to make sure that our neighborhood has bad parks and lousy infrastructure so that we can stay? I mean, it's just devastating to what a community developer is trying to do, and yet it's the lived experience of people in a lot of our communities.
Yeah, but the other side of that is, as you build new affordable or new mixed income developments and increase density, there's no money out there to increase open space proportionately.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of what you can do is shaped by the public resources that are available. Mimi's asking a little bit about what on this naturally occurring affordable housing. Yeah, getting at the example you give, the 2 or 3 family that's owned by a senior who bought the house 50 years ago, probably doesn't even have a mortgage. She's been offering things at sort of low rents because she likes her tenants and it's just the way she's always done it. I don't have a great answer to that. I don't have a great answer. You know, in Somerville, the CDC has been trying to buy these homes when they come on the market. It's a very difficult strategy to buy 2 and 3 family homes one at a time. The neighborhood of affordable housing in East Boston has done that as well, but you know, these properties are typically 100 years old, often have a lot of deferred maintenance. You don't know what you're buying until you get in there. And many of these owners, seniors or others, you know, like it's their chance to get wealth. It's their chance. This piece of property was their family's pathway. And if they can sell it for $1 million, like, why shouldn't they? You know, so the 2 and 3 family stock, which is so huge in our state, is a tough piece. You know, as much as we might bemoan some of the gentrification in a place like South Boston or Dorchester or East Boston, you know, there were some select families that probably did really well by selling their house for a lot more than they bought it years ago. And their family and all the people in that family are going to benefit from that. So it goes back a little bit to that private wealth versus community wealth trade-off.
But Joe, within that, just thinking a little bit about that, the challenge, because we've been thinking about housing just in terms of individual units, rather than thinking about it in terms of multi-units so that diversifying instead of having a few owners who own a lot of the property. So going back to that issue around, 90% being rentals, if it's 50-50 and that instead of, 50% of the neighborhood being owned by 5 owners, if it's 50% being owned by 20% of your or 50% of your population, that sense about absentee landlords and the goods that come with that. And our CDC's grappling with that, about sort of looking at how to be able to balance those tensions in an innovative way in terms of different ways of thinking about ownership.
I would say mostly not. I think most CDCs that are focused on what they're going to build and own and manage first and foremost. And then if they're doing something else, they're thinking about individual home buyers buying single family homes or 2 and 3 family homes and helping them do that. Very few CDCs, to my knowledge, are really trying to engage around the question of, well, who owns all these triple deckers that are investor owned, or the 6 and 10 and 20 unit apartment buildings that have been built over the years. We got a bunch of like 12 to 20 unit apartment buildings in my neighborhood that were built in the 70s. I have no idea who owns them. And they're a pretty important part of our housing stock here. So, but I think that is not typically what CDCs have done. I think it's important to do, both to support local owners so they can, and acquiring them and selling them to local owners, or helping small, community-oriented landlords in the private sector. But my observation is I don't see a lot of that. I think I'm going to stop there on housing. There's obviously more to be said about it. I decided for this class to focus on kind of why we do the housing and the types of housing interventions. If you want to learn more about, well, how do these developments actually get put together? How are they financed? What kinds of incomes and why? Like I said, there are other classes that we offer for that, and it's important to understand that ultimately, but we just don't have time today. And I think sometimes we get so focused on the transaction that we lose sight of these larger community goals. So that's why I cover this the way I do. So we got about 20 minutes left. We're going to ask you all to do an evaluation at the end, so please hang in there for that. But I want to talk a little bit about this idea of comprehensive community development. Now, arguably, the word comprehensive is redundant. The community development is inherently comprehensive, but the term has been adopted around the country over the last 20 years, and I think it's worth thinking about it. And so there's really 2 dimensions to this idea, and both of which we've talked about a little bit today. One is working across a range of issues and interventions to comprehensively address the challenges that people face in their lives, and doing so in a way that really is building resident voice, community power. Characteristics of comprehensive community development. A lot of this comes, by the way, from a research report by the Aspen Institute that came out several years ago that looked at various initiatives around the country and what they were finding when organizations, either individually or through collaborations, tried to take this approach. These types of initiatives do focus on a geography. These tend to be focusing on a community of place and saying, drawing a circle around a place and saying, we're going to go into this geography and we're going to deliver housing and jobs and business and schools and the whole thing so that the people who live here get to benefit from the synergy that gets created by doing these things together. We're trying to change things at a population level here, in addition to helping, an individual family save a little more money, or an individual family buy a house, or an individual family person get a new job. We're looking at trying to achieve population level change. They have to be highly tailored to the specific neighborhood and the context, the assets in that community, the challenges in that community. Issues of racial equity always come into play, or virtually always come into play, because you're usually dealing with communities that are racially and ethnically diverse. And you're trying to think long-term. So does it work? Is this actually an effective way to try to drive change in our society? And according to the Aspen Institute, this is these are their conclusions, but they resonate for me, so I use them, that you do see and you can measure improvement in people's lives at the individual and family level. You see people getting better incomes. You see people moving into homeownership. If you focus resources in a particular way over a sustained period of time, you will see change. It's harder to see that at a community or population level. And that is in part because, one person gets the job, but 3 people applied for it. These things aren't always completely additive. We're dealing in an overall environment of scarcity and limited resources. And then, clearly you need these sort of community level interventions and strategies, but it doesn't substitute for broader macroeconomic solutions, whether it's a minimum wage or tax policy or trade policy that affects the overall economy. These things aren't divorced from the overall economy. So it's not really a substitute for thoughtful, progressive, equitable public policy. When you engage in these kind of comprehensive efforts, there's sort of a couple of more tensions and dynamics you have to deal with. One is around process versus product. We're definitely very focused on the process of engaging residents, engaging stakeholders, talking to everybody having a voice and a say, but it's exhausting. There can be a lot of conflict. You can spend a long time coming up with plans, and oftentimes they don't come to fruition, and that frustrates people. So some thoughts about how to navigate that is, this goes back to that early chart around community building. Not every decision at every moment, at every time needs to have a year-long planning process that involves 500 people. Sometimes you can just move forward. Sometimes you need that broader process. So be intentional about that. And these complex collaborations require a lot of investment in time in the collaboration itself. And so that needs to be funded, and people need to really plan for that and staff that. Another tension is we all recognize that people's lives are challenging across a number of dimensions, and that their success ultimately depends on success across all those dimensions. But if you're trying to do 6 things at once, it's harder to demonstrate success. If you're doing one thing and you're doing it well, you're more likely to get success. If you're completely focused on helping people save money, and you have a match savings program, and you're doing budgeting and counseling and coaching, and you're coming together every month to see how they're doing, you're going to see people save money and improve their credit scores. But it's hard to do that and address housing and education and everything else at the same time. So that's another challenge. I like this idea of, you could drown under the weight of comprehensiveness. So think of it as a lens, not a requirement that you should be thinking about all these different dimensions, but it's okay to focus on 1 or 2 things and let other people do something else. And then this comes up in community development all across the board, whether you're acting comprehensively or not, but it's sort of like this inside-outside thing. That to do community development, you have to work cooperatively with government and with the private sector. And that can put you in tension with, community goals and community residents. And, you can become perceived as being part of the very system we're trying to change. So, that's another dynamic. That we have to invest in structural change as well as sort of transactional change. And that, sometimes the powerful entities we're dealing with are also under capacity and need learning and support. So this is sort of where we land. I'm going through this pretty quick, but I think it's just important to touch on that to have sustainable community change, there's this democratic institution building. Again, that's just different language in some ways for the civic engagement, civic building thing we talked about at the top of the class. You see this word now more and more, community platform, as opposed to community organization, or not necessarily opposed, but in addition to. The idea of a platform, I think, is maybe not an incorporated organization with a board of directors, but it's a table or it's a conversation that is set up where people come together to work together in a community. And this idea of stewardship, I really wanted to emphasize. There's a lot of excitement and intention when you build a new building, but as we said, it's going to be there for 50 years. So if you don't have a strategy for stewarding that building over time, to maintain it, take care of the residents, to deal with the transitions and changes in the resident population, long-term stewardship is essential to any kind of community change. Otherwise, it's going to be very fleeting. And that's another powerful argument for community-based institutions who have a stake in that long-term stewardship. They're not moving on to the next community or the next place. They're really rooted there. And so stewardship is an important principle or value in community development. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the community investment tax credit other than say that this was a big initiative of ours about 10 years ago that was designed to create a funding stream that would be very flexible and allow community developers to do what communities want. And it's a donation tax credit. Some of you may be familiar, but if you participate in this program, you give a donation to a CDC, you get 50% of it back from the state. So it's a way of generating more private donations. And last year, we probably got about $16 million statewide through that tool. Essentially 8 million coming in tax credits and 8 million from donors. So it's like a public-private partnership. But the thing I wanted to emphasize is this slide, and I think I'm gonna kind of leave with this and then we can have some discussion as we wrap up. But when we were designing, we wanted to design a funding stream for community development that was going to be flexible for different kinds of places, that was going to drive resources to the most effective in community development groups, and that would allow for sort of demand-driven community development where community residents were really shaping the strategy and the agenda. And so we looked around the country at a variety of initiatives. We did a lot of research about what do the best CDCs look like in America? What are their attributes? What are their qualities? And how can we create a funding stream that drives organizations in the direction of those qualities and supports them in those activities? And we kind of landed on this figure here. That the best CDCs in America, the most durable CDCs in America, the CDCs that have achieved the most impact, are CDCs that can operate effectively across these three dimensions of community, government, and private sector. So you'll notice the community circle is the biggest circle. That's intentional. That at its heart, you can't be an effective community development corporation if you don't have deep roots in a community, that you don't have a deep understanding of the history of that place, the people who live there, that you don't have relationships with other community-based groups and stakeholders and residents. You guys know what it means to be of a place and to know people and to be rooted there and accountable. So the community, you have to have that. Otherwise, it's not community development by definition. But you also, if you want to get things done, if you want to build new affordable housing, if you want to offer small business development programs, if you want to help small businesses get the licensing they need to open and operate, you have to be able to navigate the government and the public sector. You have to be able to apply successfully for government funds. You have to be able to convince the government that you know what you're doing and that if they give you money, you'll spend it wisely and legally. There's a political aspect to that for sure in terms of relationships, as well as a competence aspect of that. CDCs that go to war with City Hall usually lose. They might win a battle here and there, but usually over time, it's really hard to be successful if you're constantly in conflict with local government. And you have to be able to attract and manage private capital. Virtually everything we do at some level involves leveraging and drawing private capital, whether those are loans or investments or philanthropy, into the community in service of the community agenda. So you have to be able to talk their language. You have to be able to convince them that you know what you're doing. And obviously, these three sectors are in tension and in conflict and have different goals and aspirations for what they want to see happen. So to be able to do all three of those things and to maintain those relationships and to be effective in working at all three levels, you have to be a pretty competent organization. You have to have high professional competency. You have to have good community relations, community organizing, community engagement capacity. You have to have communications and data management capacity. And so we thought if we could design a program that really leaned into this framework, we would be both funding the strongest organizations and helping all the organizations become stronger. And so much of what this whole field is about is the dance between and among these three sectors. And the community investment tax credit does that by saying, A, to participate, you have to be a community-based organization, as we discussed. You apply to the government for the tax credits. And when you get the tax credits, you go to the private sectors for the donations. So you have to, in order to access resources through the community investment tax credit, be at least reasonably capable of working in these three spheres. And it's part of what makes the field exciting. It's part of what makes it challenging. It's part of why sometimes community developers are perceived by one of these stakeholders as being kind of off base. Community groups might see you as being too cozy with City Hall. City Hall might see you as being too adversarial. At some level, that's just built into the structure. So I'm going to leave that because I feel like this diagram really sort of encapsulates what community development entails. And we have a few minutes for some questions or comments or pushback, and then we'll do our evaluation and we'll be done.
Yeah, we have a couple questions in the chat if you want to take a look, Joe. Or I'm happy to read them out.
Yeah. So what's an example of a community platform in this context? So good question. So in 2010, 11, something like that, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which is a Boston-based group, funded 3 neighborhoods, Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester, and the Codman Square neighborhood of Dorchester, to develop a comprehensive community development strategy and then support the implementation of that strategy. And so in each case, they funded a community-based group to sort of host and kind of facilitate the process. But by design, by requirement to get the resources to participate, they had to essentially set up a community-wide collaboration of stakeholders, community-based organizations, local business owners, some elected officials who had to come together. I think in those days, literally at a table. Today would be in a Zoom meeting, but literally at a table on a regular basis, working through what do we want to do to make this community a better place. And they would host, they went through a whole community engagement process of community meetings and surveys and door-to-door knocking and house parties and small group conversations, came up with a very ambitious agendas for those neighborhoods and went through a process of sorting out like, okay, the Boys and Girls Club is going to do this and the library is going to do that and the community health center is going to do this, and nobody's really able to do this one, so we're going to have to drop that from the plan. And this was a model of sort of community collaboration that first emerged out of Chicago, but that a lot of people have tried to replicate. And so that's what I mean by a platform. There was a structure for collective decision-making among these stakeholders that was sort of at a level above any individual organization. Then there's a comment I know about the SBA.
Can I ask how much they funded that at?
You can ask, can I remember though? I think they were getting about $125,000, $150,000 a year for 3 years. And there might've been some other in-kind supports that were coming along with that. It definitely funded at least one full-time person to kind of coordinate it all. And And then there was some implementation money for specific projects that emerged. Although most of the implementation money was they would be applying for through the regular government funding streams. That's my memory. And this was 10 years ago, and that money might have gone a little further than it would today. But ultimately, I mean, the challenge is, of course, sustaining that, funding it appropriately, and then sustaining it over time. And, those initiatives were time limited by design, I think 3 or 5 years. A lot of the work that was envisioned has continued, to be sure, although I think there's been some dispersal or whatever, how you say that word, of the parties. And, and it worked better in some neighborhoods too. I mean, sometimes it doesn't come together. Other thoughts, observations, or questions about how this works? When I teach the class, the first assignment is to look up on the internet to try to find a definition of community development, and then define 3 of them. And then we compare and contrast in class. And I think if you did that, you would see that there are a lot of different ways that people define it and think about it. And I would just say it's not a hard and fast, it's ever evolving. And to that point, I did have a couple of slides here. I guess I should cover. Obviously, community development corporations, like everybody else, had to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And this was a good example where having a community institution that had resources, had staff, had capacity, allowed for a level of community response that maybe otherwise wouldn't have happened in terms of taking care of the residents of the people who live in CDC-owned housing, providing food and access to information and supports, helping businesses get grants and other relief efforts. And it really kind of revealed what I think a lot of us already knew, which is that community developers are actually part of our disaster response infrastructure as a country. And we saw that up in Lawrence when the Columbia gas explosions happened. We saw it in Springfield when there was a tornado. We saw it in New Jersey when the Superstorm Sandy. We certainly saw it in Katrina and New Orleans. When major disasters happen in a place, CDCs are part of the infrastructure that responds to that. I think we need to own that more. And I think coming out of COVID, you're going to see the community development field embracing resiliency and disaster response as one of our core functions, and thinking more about how we sustain that over time. And then just quickly about some of the other ways in which I think the field is going to be evolving in the future. Like I said, our role as second responders during the disasters. You're seeing the integration of community development with all these other sectors: health equity, climate resiliency, racial equity movement, public safety, education. That's a challenge for those of us in the field, because again, it's hard to be active and knowledgeable and smart and thoughtful and rooted in all these different domains. But I think the connections are so powerful that people are experimenting and innovating with new ways of doing that. And then we're also seeing a couple of other key transitions in the field. By now, most of the original founders of the field have retired, but now we're sort of seeing that second wave of folks. And we had 7 new executive directors last year. I think we had 3 the year before. We're seeing a pretty rapid turnover in the leadership of the field, and that's going to bring new change. And then technology, and we mentioned this earlier just in terms of remote work, and but the way in which technology facilitates different kinds of communication, data management, evaluation. Technology is going to have a big impact on our field in the next 10 years as well. So like I said, this is an ever-changing and evolving field. And anyone who sort of gets locked into community development is what it was in the 70s or 80s is in big trouble. So don't let that happen to you. So I'll end there and let Leah tell you about the evaluation. And we definitely would love to have your feedback. And you should know how to reach me on email and Twitter. If you want to engage with me at all directly, I'm available. Leah?
Sure. So I put the evaluation link in the chat. So feel free to just take care of that right now while we have a couple minutes. And I will follow up with an email with the PowerPoint slides as well as the recording. And we actually do have one more question in the chat, which is, how can CDCs improve education?
Yes, I see that. Well, We had a forum on this topic scheduled for April 3rd, 2020 that was canceled. And I still want to do this forum because there are a few CDCs, Lawrence Community Works in particular, EBA in the South End, Maine South CDC, one Holyoke out in Holyoke, that have really deep partnerships with their local schools. And at one level, of course, is housing stability is essential for children to learn. It's very difficult to do well in school if you don't have stable housing, even more so now during COVID. But beyond that sort of clear connection, a lot of CDCs are collaborating with their schools around out-of-school learning. In Lawrence, they have a whole program at the CDC to train, I think they're paraprofessionals to go into the schools, and it's actually a workforce development strategy for parents in the community, but it's also a way of connecting the school to community resources. So I'm not actually an expert in all this, but I think that's what some CDCs are sort of understanding, that for their neighborhood to improve, they have to have great schools. That's a great way to engage parents because that's what parents care about. So by connecting to schools and to youth development is a way to get more people involved in their civic work. So I think that's the way some of the folks are thinking about it. I'll stop there just because we don't have a lot of time, but